Please be seated. Court of Inquiry into the Mine Fire is now in session.
Members of the Board, Mr Harkins has been waiting patiently all day, but before I recall him, there are a couple of issues I wanted to raise formally with the Board and before the parties. Yesterday, during Mr Mitchell's evidence, it emerged that there had been a high-level meeting that occurred here on the morning of the 28th of February between Mr Mitchell and officers of the Council, Dr Lester, Mr Merritt, Commissioner Lapsley, and I think the Chief Commissioner of Police as well. And that was the first. The inquiry was aware of that meeting. On becoming aware of it, we, Council Assisting, called for production of the map that was discussed at that meeting and also any minutes or other record that was made of that meeting. I've discussed it with Dr Wilson and Mr Burns for the State just over the lunch and adjournment, and have asked that they identify those documents. And we are acutely aware that we only have one more week of evidence, so it's our request that those documents be provided over the weekend and be available for the inquiry when it resumes hearings on Tuesday morning. The other matter that I wish to raise is a communication that...
Sorry, Mr Richards. Mr Wilson, could you just confirm that could take place, please?
Well, there's a couple of aspects to this. First, in keeping with our approach throughout, we are acutely aware of our need to cooperate and help and be responsive to all requests, reasonable or otherwise, that's made for our friends. And we are doing that. As to the meeting on the 28th, it surprised us as well to hear about it because no one else has spoken about it, and one of two conclusions can be drawn. A, it didn't happen as alleged, or B, it was not of the form that the witness who spoke about it took. That aside, we are pursuing the inquiry and we responded to the request as soon as we could. That has not found favour with the requesters, but we're pursuing it and we will continue to pursue it until all stones are unturned.
Thank you, Dr Wilson, and you do appreciate that sooner...
Oh yes, time is everything.
No, thank you.
And for the record, Council Assisting have never made an unreasonable request, except perhaps when it comes to time limits, but those are outside of our own control. The other matter that I wish to raise is a communication that the inquiry received this morning, directed to Mr Rosen from the United Firefighters Union, which is one of the parties that has been granted limited leave to appear. The communication relates directly to evidence that we heard earlier this week about monitoring of carbon monoxide levels in the community rather than in the mine on the 15th and 16th of February. There's a very delicate issue that is raised by the evidence that the inquiry has heard so far, which, and on one characterisation of the evidence, there was a responsible intervention by the authorities and specifically the Department of Health and the Environment Protection Authority, so that alarming and unnecessary warnings were not given. On another interpretation of the evidence, there was a failure to monitor and to act on alarmingly high levels of carbon monoxide in the community. At this stage, the evidence is capable of both of those interpretations. The communication...
Mr.
Yes.
And Dr Torre
and Dr Lester.
Dr Lester have all evidence. Talked about aspects of it.
Yes. Yes. And the evidence doesn't give a complete picture, but there is a picture that emerges. And there's also questions about the appropriate standard for the monitoring that was being undertaken and the appropriate standard for decision-making and action consequent upon that monitoring. The information that's come forward from the United Firefighters Union today is substantially an anonymous statement from a firefighter employed by the Metropolitan Fire Brigade, who I'll refer to as Firefighter L. The union assert that it has not disclosed his identity due to concerns of possible retribution in the context that firefighters have been gagged from disclosing such information publicly. I have no idea of the substance of that assertion, but it's been made and it's the basis on which Firefighter L's identity is not being not being disclosed to the inquiry at this stage. Firefighter L was here in Morwell fighting the fire over the weekend of the 15th and 16th, and apparently has evidence that's relevant to the issue that the inquiry has been exploring. It's highly regrettable that this information arrived after the relevant witnesses had already given evidence. It's also regrettable that it was aired in the media before being raised with the inquiry. But that said, the inquiry would be very interested to speak with Firefighter L and perhaps to hear his evidence in the course of next week. And it occurs to me that the best way forward is to seek an assurance from the state on behalf of the Metropolitan Fire Brigade that any firefighter who has relevant evidence to give to the inquiry will not suffer retributions as a consequence of having done so. And if that assurance can be given, then perhaps we can move forward with the United Firefighters Union and actually speak to the firefighter who has relevant evidence to give.
There's not enough available to be able to ask the VGSO to investigate at the moment whether there's anything that is relevant that could be otherwise obtained.
It is difficult to act on an anonymous disclosure. Without knowing who the firefighter is, I wouldn't expect my learned friends or those for whom they act to do anything.
Do you want to say anything? Yes.
Well, this very hard to respond to something about which we know nothing, and can we leave it at that? We have no idea what this is all about, and haven't been favoured with a shred of paper about it. But I don't know how to proceed in that state of a vacuum. We obviously...
There's an appreciation of your position, and I think we'll just continue to follow the matter through to the extent that we're able to do so.
Exactly. Thank you, Board.
Oh, sorry, there was this question of that has been raised as to whether you can, in effect, make the inquiry as to whether, in that whistleblower domain, there's something that's appropriate to do that might be followed up.
Well, if my friend can tell me what she has in mind beyond asking us to undertake that something won't be done which already is inherently illegal, we'll do it. But maybe a private conversation is a good start.
Yes.
I raise it publicly partly because there has been substantial airing of the issue in the media, and as I understand it, the response from the Fire Services Commissioner in the media has been that this is a matter for the inquiry, but we're in a quandary because we can't have the evidence of Firefighter L without some kind of assurance being given.
It's appropriate to be aired.
And I just ask my learned friend to seek instructions from those who instruct him, and if he's able to give the assurance next week, that be done. So after all of that, I recall Mr. Harkins.
It's really down here.
Mr. Harkins, I remind you that you have made an affirmation and that you are still subject to that affirmation.
Welcome back for the second time, Mr. Harkins, and I apologise for the long wait today.
That's fine.
Now, the reason we've asked you to come back this afternoon is to ask you some questions about your second statement, which you adopted last Friday. But before I do that, you've provided a third statement to the inquiry, directly in response to an inquiry from Ms Petering about the number of employees who were present at the mine at various stages on the 9th of February. And that statement has been provided by you. The short answer is that before midday there were 35 personnel at the mine.
Yes.
At 3:30 there were 58 personnel at the mine, and by 7 p.m. there were 103 personnel at the mine. And you've gone to the trouble of identifying them and by reference to the shift that they work on or their various classifications within the mine. I should ask you formally, is that statement true and correct?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. I tender that if I might. Thank you, Your Honour. Just to be clear, what was the source of the information that you have extracted into this statement?
The source of the information is the rosters, HR payroll system, and some security records.
Thank you. Thank you for undertaking that exercise. Standard. All right. Thank you. Now, moving to your second statement, I wanted to start by asking you to recap on the range of your responsibilities as Director of People, Culture and Environment.
Fine. The department covers human resources, industrial relations, occupational health and safety, internal communications, and I think there's one I've forgotten, but that's generally the thrust.
All right, so external communications is not strictly within your
local external communications fits within the asset. We have a framework of resources. Of course, we have some resources down in our head office in Melbourne who provide advice and additional resources. So I think you'd be aware that our external media consultant is Trevor Rowe. There's a number of attachments that include statements from Mr. Rowe to the media. So we have access to those resources as well. But local external communications generally handled at the asset with advice.
Right. By you or by Mr. Graham?
Generally by Mr. Graham, but prepared by my group and the external consulting resources that we have at our disposal.
Now, can I ask you about the communication staff or public affairs staff, I'm not sure of the terminology, that are employed at the Hazelwood asset?
At the Hazelwood asset, we have one internal communications manager.
All right. And her role, I think it's she?
Yes, yes.
Is responsible for communication essentially between the mine or between management and personnel.
Primarily, but her functions extend to community engagement and our local support programs and donation sponsorships, local media. So it's probably not titled all that well as internal communications manager, and it has morphed over the last 12 months into a broader role.
Local communications manager.
Local would probably be better.
And Hazelwood is, of course, only one aspect of GDF Sewer's Australian operations.
Correct.
Is there a communications capacity in the Melbourne office?
There is, and that's provided by Mr. Rowe. So he handles external media for GDF Sewer's Australian Energy, but he also handles communications locally for Rialto, and there is a internal communications resource at our partner asset, Loyang B, over in Trelvin. All right.
And is Mr. Rowe employed by GDF Sewers, or is he a consultant?
He's a consultant.
A consultant. Is he part of a larger public relations firm?
No, I don't believe so. I believe he works for himself.
And is he the extent of the public relations assistance, external public relations assistance that...
we have other consultants that we use for PR consultancy, as well as media monitoring and social media monitoring. And of course we have a corporate affairs area that deals primarily with the political interface and so forth.
Right. If I can go to your second statement, paragraph 50, starting at paragraph 51 under the heading Community Engagement. In the normal course of events, regardless of mine fires, GDF Sewers does engage in a range of community engagement activities here in the Latrobe Valley.
Correct.
Can you outline what those are?
Broadly, the framework has three main areas. So we have a long-standing commitment to land care, the land care program, both locally and I think primarily down at Phillip Island. We commit about $200,000 a year to that program and run various events where employees are able to engage with that program directly. We have last year established a relationship with FareShare, which is best described as an organisation that rescues food, good food, not bad food, cooks it, prepares it, creates what's called wet packs rather than the dried food, canned foods and so forth. We've entered into a 3-year, I think, relationship with them, and we've been able to bring that program to the Latrobe Valley. So we have a number of local charities that came on board with that and now distribute the wet packs to those that need it in the community. And then we have an education element to it. At the moment, that's been focused largely on electrical engineering development. As you would imagine, that's a fairly important area of education for our particular industry. And I believe we sponsor at the moment 2, but I believe there's another intake happening shortly.
So
and then,
is this in the nature of internships or
generally
recruiting potential engineers to work?
We'd like them to stay with us, but
yes.
Generally internships we pay for their part of their schooling. They are able to work in when university is not happening for us in a paid environment, and generally to support that particular element of engineering. And as I was saying, there's a 4th element really, which is what we'll call the local, I prefer to call it grassroots sponsorship donations programs that small, medium and large businesses have, and that will range from sponsoring some small event for a sports club or equipment for a netball club and so forth. So we have a program each year for that, but I did a bit of
You've given some examples of that in paragraph 53D.
I'm sure I have, yes. And I think locally, the total financial commitment, not the in-kind commitment and support through, the employees doing land care programs, is around $600,000 a year.
And then in the following paragraph 54, you make what is possibly an obvious point, but it does need to be stated that Hazelwood is one of the largest employers in the Latrobe Valley.
It is. It's not the largest. I understand that to be the Latrobe Regional Hospital, I think, from memory. But we're a substantial employer. We have 500 direct employees, and we quote around 300 full-time contracting people fully engaged with the business. I won't be rude enough to quote the amount of salaries that I've put in my witness statement there. But and of course we spend, as you'd imagine, with maintenance, ancillary services, other miscellaneous purchases, quite a substantial amount of money, both in the local and broader community.
Ms Richards, if I may. Mr Harkins, it's a commendable list. One of the things that came out in the community consultation sessions was around community engagement, and my understanding was that there was a group, I'm going to call it the CAG, or the Community Engagement, Community Advisory Group.
It's what we call the Corporate Social Capital Committee.
No. So that you engage with members of the community around mine operations, future issues concerning the community.
I don't recall that specifically.
So some of the community consultations were talking around, I can't recall the exact title, but I think there's a member of the local council on a particular group.
This is the Environmental Management Committee?
Could be.
Yes, it's the Environmental Management Committee. So we have a committee that meets quarterly, reviewing our environmental performance and so forth, and that's made up of citizens, members of the Latrobe Council, EPA and so forth. I really wouldn't say that was in terms of the community engagement I've been talking about. That's much more around our performance in the environmental arena.
So I would put that is quite an integral part of being involving the community, rather than just perhaps a list of sponsorships. Yep. But the actual engagement around issues that we'll cover next week on rehabilitation and how the mine impacts on the community. So are those topics particularly covered under this environmental management committee?
Certainly the mine plan and any variations to that would be discussed at the environmental management committee, yes.
And implications or impacts to the community?
Would be discussed at that committee.
And you meet quarterly?
I believe so. I haven't attended one yet.
Are you a regular member?
Generally, we will have our environmental manager and our operational managers will be there, and then a broad range of community and other representatives from council and so forth, as I said.
So I think paragraph 52 of your statement talks about your engagement program.
Yes.
So meetings with leaders, departments, local councils to provide updates. So what do you call, what's that? What are those meetings? What committee structure do they come under?
I wouldn't say that all of that statement's about a formal committee. We meet regularly with other community leaders, Advance Morwell, keep them up to date with what's happening at Hazelwood and in the industry generally. These would be more informal rather than a committee structure.
So how often might you meet?
Generally, we try to get around to most of the community leaders, government, local members and so forth once a quarter. I wouldn't put my hand on my heart and say that we always do that, but certainly, as you would imagine, we haven't had one of those this year.
Although you've had plenty of contact with all of those.
We have indeed, yes.
This activity is separate and distinct from the activity of is it the Environment Review Committee or the Environment Management Committee?
I think it's the Environmental Review Committee from memory.
Yes, and that committee's a requirement of
Correct.
the mine's work plan, is it not?
Correct.
And the inquiry's been provided with a number of minutes of those committee meetings.
And perhaps just lastly, if I may, in relation to the issue perhaps that we've raised just after lunch on the carbon monoxide monitoring the community, do GDF undertake monitoring of the carbon monoxide levels? Is it only down on the floor of the mine? Could you just clarify for me the monitoring that GDF undertake of carbon monoxide levels?
In terms of routine monitoring?
Well, particularly if there's a fire.
If there's a fire, that will be area-based, so primarily that will be around the personal, I think I referred to them last week as the canaries. So
Canaries, yeah.
I'm not aware that we specifically have any permanent stations. There may be one that does monitor the carbon monoxide, but generally it would be we have a fire, we're dispatching people to that fire, and here is the personal monitor.
And anything on the perimeter of the mine?
Not that I'm aware of, other than I believe we do monitor fugitive dust.
What's that?
Well, basically dust that blows out of the mine on a windy day.
Dust that escapes.
Yes. So that is regularly monitored and reported.
Thank you.
Mr Harkins, I think you were present in the hearing room yesterday when Professor McNamara and Mr Drummond gave their evidence, and Professor McNamara in particular was critical of the apparent lack of a pre-planning about crisis communications on the part of GDF Sewers. And it was put to him by Mr Reardon that he hadn't examined the emergency response plan of the mine, and he agreed. So let's do that now. Could we please have the emergency response plan up on the screen? It's Exhibit 11. And I think we have a hard copy for you, Mr Harkins.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I think you can turn straight to page 35 of 47. And on my perusal of the plan,
Yep.
That's what it says about communication with media, public and stakeholders.
That's correct.
Is there any more anywhere else?
Certainly not in the emergency response plan that I'm aware of.
Is there any more in any other policy or procedure of GDF
There are
Hazelwood?
there are policies on engagement with external media,
Yes.
But they are general policies. They're not specific to an emergency response.
So if we are looking for a prior planning about crisis communication, this is it. Is that correct?
This is not about prior planning. This is a statement of authorisation, I suppose, or who can respond. The prior planning would go to our annual training and assessment that we do under Part 6 of the Terrorism Act with the other government departments. So our planning and processes are for communication and response, for that matter, annually tested in that exercise.
Right, so there is prior planning, is there?
Well, there's certainly prior practice.
Prior practice.
Yes.
But in terms of planning to respond to a fire in the mine that is affecting the community, is there anything that the inquiry should look at apart from what appears in Part 9 of the Emergency Response Plan? And what it provides is that all media inquiries are to be referred to a member of the IPRH, that's Hazelwood,
yes,
isn't it? Public affairs staff as quickly as possible. Now, who is that?
That would be our internal communications manager or myself.
All right. Public comment on an emergency is the responsibility of the CEO. Is that Mr. Graham?
That's, yes, we now refer to it as the asset manager.
The asset manager. That title has changed, but
yes,
it's Mr. Graham. It's not someone in head office. It's the local.
It tends to be focused very much on the local. Although, as I said earlier, we have Mr. Rowe, who is our external media manager. So, whilst all references from external media would be either channeled to the internal communications manager, or we'll call it local communications manager, myself or Mr. Graham, they would be referred to Trevor Rowe.
All right. And so the three of you and does she have a name?
It's Lauren.
Lauren, and Trevor Rowe would be Mr. Graham's delegated public affairs spokespersons. Is that correct?
Correct.
And where possible, a release of a joint media statement may be made with the combating agencies.
Correct.
And then there is a prohibition on other personnel responding to media questions.
Correct.
And media are to be denied access if they appear at the front gates until public affairs staff are there to deal with them.
Correct.
All right.
So, Mr. Harkins, just on that line about the pre-planning and identification of community leaders, has that work been undertaken perhaps to the extent that was discussed yesterday?
No, it hasn't. Not to the extent that we have a number of long-standing relationships with community leaders, but in terms of the pre-planning for an extended event like the mine fire, I wouldn't sit here and say that's robust, and certainly needs to be reviewed.
So this protocol ensures that there is one voice or a small group who are speaking on behalf of GDF Suez Hazelwood.
Correct.
But there's no contemplation that GDF Hazelwood would not make public comment during an emergency, is there?
I think in this particular document you could read it that way. I think, as I said earlier, the training that we go through on an annual basis is very, very clear that in an emergency situation where there is a incident controller, an external incident controller, it is very well understood by people at Hazelwood that they are the primary and the sole source of media releases and so forth. Now, that doesn't, I think there what we're suggesting is where possible we'll do joint media releases.
Yes.
And I think, as we discussed today, that in playing out in a long-term emergency needs to be reviewed.
Now, you've identified Mr Rowe as an external media consultant. Did GDF Suez engage additional public relations assistance during the fire?
Yes, we did.
Who did you engage?
And I won't remember their names, but certainly we engaged a PR firm to manage the or to report on the social media.
Right.
And we have engaged a further PR consultant to assist us during this phase.
During this phase?
This phase.
During the inquiry
during
phase?
the fire, I cannot recall that we augmented the team.
Right. So this is a fourth phase of emergency response, is it? Or emergency management, preparation, response, recovery and inquiry.
I wouldn't quite express it like that, but it's certainly the fourth month.
All right. Now, initially, when the fire did take hold in the mine on the 9th of February, Hazelwood did make comment to the media, did it not?
We did. It was late evening. We were contacted by the ABC 24 from memory, and Mr. Rowe made a statement.
Yes. Did any other person in senior management, either at Hazelwood or in Melbourne, make comment to the media in the early stages of the fire?
Not on the first night.
No.
There were a number of, I believe on day 3 we had a visit by Dr. Napthine. It may have been day 3 or day 4, I can't remember, around the 11th. And our head of generation, Luke Deepforce, was present at that visit and was interviewed by one of the channels, and I can't recall, it may have been Channel 10 at the time.
Now, there were community meetings held in Morwell at Kernot Hall on the 14th and the 18th of February. We've had conflicting evidence about GDF Suez' participation in those meetings. You can set the record straight, I think. To begin with, was GDF Suez invited to attend and participate in the meeting?
The meeting of the 14th, we were contacted in the, I believe, late afternoon of the 13th,
yes, regarding
that there would be a community meeting.
And the community meetings were both organised by the incident controller, were they not?
I understand that, yes.
So on the afternoon of the 13th, somebody on the incident management team contacted you personally?
No, not myself. I contacted our local communications manager, as I'll call her now, and advised us that there would be a community meeting planned for the Friday night. The verbal advice we received was its focus was on health issues, and that was on the, I think, late Thursday afternoon that we were advised of that.
But you understood that it was being convened by the incident controller.
I understood that, yes.
And it was almost inevitable that there would be some discussion about the efforts to put the fire out.
Correct.
Was it not?
Yes.
And clearly there were a range of other issues calling for discussion. So GDF was asked to attend. Did you send a representative to the meeting?
No, we did not.
No, why not?
We felt at the time, and again I have to put context, because if I read the statement there that and on paper it says, oh, it was health and therefore we weren't interested, that reads very ordinarily, and I admit that that's not a good symbol. At the time, the context was day 4 of the fire, and I think by now the inquiries would have heard just how busy things were at that time. We had already established the protocol with the incident controller that in terms of fire operations and response and so forth, that they were the sole voice on that matter, quite appropriately so. And we provided a number of updates or key messages, I suppose, to the incident controller to use at that meeting. But our focus remained, and I think Mr. Dugan spoke about this maybe last week, that very early on, it was very clear to us, and to this day I still believe, that the greatest thing that we could do was to focus all of our energies on getting the fire out. Now, I accept that up until yesterday, in retrospect and in hindsight, that was probably not the right call. But I say up until yesterday.
So it was yesterday that you realised that perhaps it wasn't the right call?
No, I believed in the preparation of this evidence for the inquiry, that looking back I can understand why some in the community see that was not good, showed a lack of empathy and so forth, and quite frankly, I can understand why they believe that. I understood these community meetings to be formal meetings that would be chaired by somebody that was experienced at chairing these meetings. So when I heard yesterday that potentially wasn't the case, I'm wondering now whether a GDF representative's appearance at that meeting may have actually not contributed to a fruitful meeting around the particular discussion topics that we understood it to be. Now, I'm not saying that we wouldn't have, but what was clear from the expert advice yesterday, which I listened to quite closely, was that community meetings need to be run well, structured well, and each participant needs to understand their role. At the point of Thursday on that particular week, we understood our role was to provide all of the information we could possibly provide to the incident controller regarding what was happening on the ground, and that the incident controller was managing all other communications.
No one was more focused on putting out the fire than the incident controller. You'd agree with that?
I don't think this is a matter of degrees. I would sit here and say to you that my regret that there's a perception of lack of empathy because we didn't attend that community meeting is twofold. One, it's not true. There wasn't a lack of empathy. We honestly believed, and I still believe to this day, that the sole best thing that GDF Sewers could do was to focus all of its energies on getting that fire out. The second part to my regret would be that, and we are extremely appreciative and respectful of the CFA, MFB and every other organisation that works so tirelessly to get that fire out. But there were 200 Hazelwood employees that have been lost in that messaging because we weren't present, and therefore it would appear that Hazelwood Mine sat back and allowed everybody to do this for us. And so that's a regret as well, because I think there's 200 other people that worked tirelessly for 45 days that haven't been, and I know that they wouldn't seek recognition, but they deserve it. And so there's twofold regret there. However, what I heard yesterday, I'm wondering whether it would have been a constructive appearance. I don't know.
We will never know, will we, whether
We
the
won't.
anger was because of the lack of information or whether it would have been there in any event. But just to explore that decision not to participate because you were focused on the fire a little further, now I take it that Mr Rowe wasn't in there fighting the fire, was he?
No, Mr Rowe.
No. Indeed, you have him engaged specifically to deal with public relations, do you not?
External media.
External media. Mr Dugan was the emergency commander by this time.
Correct.
And we can accept that he was fully focusing his energies on responding to the fire. But there were other resources available to GDF at Hazelwood, other people who could have attended that meeting without detracting in any way from the firefighting effort.
In hindsight, and we have that luxury now, you're probably right. But I cannot convey to you on the Thursday afternoon what the environment was like and what we were facing and what we were trying to achieve. So I regret that we didn't have somebody attend that meeting. I believe that it may have been beneficial for those in the community that needed to see us there. And I think, quite frankly, over the coming weeks and months, our communication strategy for emergencies that are beyond the period that our training has ever focused on. I mean, our focus has always been on short-term emergencies. We didn't adapt quick enough to the longer-term issues, and I think that over the coming weeks and months we need some deep reflection, advice. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that that call was incorrect.
How was that strategy developed? That strategy to really refrain from any public face of the mine being on the television, talking on the radio. The only statements that were issued by the mine were in print. Is that correct?
Apart from, as I said, our head of generation, I believe around the 11th, did give an interview, and there was some later in early March from memory on the radio. Strategy development, I don't think I'd call it development. I think it was contextual, and I think that one of the learnings that needs to be explored post this event is that we take so literally and we are trained so literally that we don't have a public comment on the activities of the emergency. That's the incident controller. We expanded that to our own detriment. And I'm not saying that we developed that or did that deliberately. I think that what we did was say, well, we're feeding everything we possibly can to incident control. That's what our role is. We need to do that. We need to keep fighting the fire, but we need to do that. And frankly, I think, as I said earlier, I think we need to reflect on how do you adapt that communication strategy or approach for a longer term event that has such a broad impact on such a wide range of people. And we need to do that.
And really raises questions about the management of risk within the mine on a longer and broader basis, does it not?
If you have a look at the risk in terms of brand damage, PR, or the way that we're making the community feel, or parts of that community.
I was actually talking more literally in terms of the risk that exposed coal faces would catch fire.
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, there was a great deal of concern in the community while the fire was burning that this was somehow the result of a failure by GDF Sewers and previous owners of the mine to manage the risk adequately. Do you accept that?
I accepted that, but we certainly did see and hear those concerns.
Yes, and that could have been responded to in the media while the fire was burning without in any way interfering with the incident controller's function.
That's possible, and in fact what we did do during that whole phase is that we had a responsive media phase. I know that for a fact because Mr Rowe would be contacted, I can't tell you how many times a day, but I spoke with Mr Rowe seeking answers on various issues and facts and figures and so forth. So we had a responsive media phase to questioning and anything that was specific that is under the incident controller's control, we directed them to the CFA media unit. But hundreds of media inquiries were dealt with over particularly the first 2 to 3 weeks.
Now, I may have overlooked it, but you don't refer in your statement to a responsive media phase. When was this phase?
It emerged very quickly from the Sunday night. Whilst the incident controller was certainly very prominent in the media from day 2, there was certainly many questions being raised by the media with respect to a variety of preparation or what GDF Sewers is and so forth. And we responded throughout, particularly the first 2 or 3 weeks, to many inquiries, and they were usually telephone calls, verbal responses and so forth.
Right, by way of provision of information in response to an inquiry rather than by way of comment, that a face or a voice speaking on behalf of the company?
No, we didn't do that.
Okay. We had some evidence yesterday from Mr Bain about MJPIC and its regional equivalent, REMJPIC, which is really a coordinated approach to public information during an emergency, either at state or regional level. Now, as I understand the evidence, GDF Sewers was not involved in either of those bodies, either at the state or the regional level. Having this opportunity to reflect, would that be a useful arrangement in future for GDF Sewers, were there to be another incident of this type in future, to actually participate in that coordinating committee?
I've had some time to reflect because I think yesterday I learned...
Made you wait so long today.
No, that's fine. Look, yesterday was an enlightening day for me in that, apart from the fact that I won't profess to understand all government structures and government department structures or all of these committees, I just don't understand it. There was terminology yesterday and committees that I'm not even aware of, and I doubt that anybody at Hazelwood is aware of. And I think what is clear, and I said earlier that we need to do some deep reflection of our longer-term emergency communication strategy and processes that can't be done in isolation. And on reflection, the way that the protocols for communication play out on the ground, or the way they certainly played out on the ground in this particular incident, was that we were very much a information provider, but operated in a vacuum of every other communication forum, some by choice. I admit we didn't turn up to the community meeting, but I had no idea of these committees and so forth. So I think we need to explore that the owner-operator of whatever facility it is needs to be much more engaged with the overall communications, particularly with the community in which we live.
So you mentioned earlier on in your evidence this afternoon the counter-terrorism training that you undertake, presumably in conjunction with
CFA,
Police,
DSDBI,
emergency services.
Yes.
And were there to be an incident that came under that regime that threatened the continuity of power supply from the station, there would surely be a need for a communication strategy.
I would agree with you.
And so there are more scenarios than just a mine fire.
Correct.
In which a joint information strategy involving GDF Sewers as the operator of the facility, which is not just any business, it's an essential
It is.
an essential facility in Victoria, and the emergency services. So that was a convoluted question, but there are other scenarios in which a coordinated approach to provision of public information would be useful.
I agree. Just for clarification, those exercises, whilst they may focus on the initiation of emergency through terrorism, they actually practice the response planning, communications with relevant government organisations and so forth. But as I said earlier, in retrospect, that training focuses on a very short-term emergency condition, and certainly in the 7 years I've been the SIM team manager at Hazelwood, I can't recall an exercise or discussion on a 45-day or a 50-day emergency event and what would that mean in terms of the interaction with the incident controller or the community and so forth. So there's omissions in that training, there's omissions in the planning from our perspective, there's no doubt about that, and we need to reflect on that given our recent experience.
Mr Harkins, what's long term?
I would believe that anything that would be 3 to 5 days would be starting to get into that longer term. But I think also there's other elements of consideration. Most of our exercises would be, and God forbid this ever happened, but a terrorist blows up a dredger or something like that, very, very internalised, threatens continuity of power supply, may impact the broader community, but not directly. We certainly haven't considered in those exercises, to my knowledge, something that had such a broad and serious impact on the local community. And I think, therefore, the determination of what's long term depends on the impact.
Although the experience at Longford would suggest that an interruption to an essential service might go on for longer than an afternoon.
Indeed.
If there were to be a fire, for example, in the slot bunker, that's likely to interrupt electricity supply for
They could make
a
it challenging,
considerable period. Yes.
So my view is that once it gets to the 1 to 3 days, you start to think that perhaps the way that you are interacting with both the incident control of the community and so forth needs to dramatically change.
And never mind the acronym, but I'm understanding your evidence to be that GDF Sewers would look favourably on an opportunity to participate in a coordinating committee that managed public information.
Correct.
Ms Richards, you mentioned the second community meeting on the 18th. Are you going back to just clarify that there were two, and so Mr Harkins has answered on the first one. So perhaps could I just clarify?
Yes.
That
No, we
GDF
did not
Sewers
attend
was
the
not
18th.
represented on the 18th
Yeah,
of
we
February
were not represented
either.
on the 18th.
And nor did GDF Sewers attend any of the community meetings organised by the Neighbourhood
Yeah, I
House.
was going to ask that too.
That would be correct, yes.
And I'm guessing that you didn't send anyone along to the Voices of the Valley events either.
No.
You talk in paragraph 60 of your statement about recognising that the public wanted more information on the fire activity as a result of feedback from the public. I'm interested in hearing a little more about what that feedback was.
That's a combination. As I said earlier, we had people looking at social media. What parts of social media I'm not familiar with. I know Facebook, Twitter and things like that. Or when I say I know them, I'm not proficient in them. Although my daughter tells me that I'm a dinosaur, there's other social media now. So we had feedback, aggregated information and so forth. We certainly...
So this was as a result of your social media monitoring that
correct,
you had
as
done?
well as by this stage, of course, we had a number of calls, and I think in my evidence there's a bit of a call log there. Clearly, whilst we were receiving the information that was coming out to the public, and we've received it at the same time, I'm not sure that we ever received any media releases or so forth in advance of the general public, and possibly neither should we, but contact numbers, we were getting phone calls about, well, how do I contact the Department of Health, how do I contact the EPA and so forth. So it was clear to us that there was some people in the community weren't aware of who to contact or how to go about doing it. Other members of the community wanted to have a talk to us about specific issues, some very colourfully. So it was very obvious by the second week that a combination of our public absence in the media and face-to-face media anyway, there was a need to try and address some of the concerns or some of the questions that were being asked. And I wouldn't suggest for 1 minute that was a proactive strategy. It was certainly reactive.
So there were the full-page advertisements in the Latrobe Valley Express that
Correct.
you refer to there at paragraph 60.
Yep.
And am I right in understanding that these were also posted on the GDF Sewers Hazelwood website?
Correct.
Simultaneously?
Yes, I believe so.
And also, rather than leaving your reception staff to field all the calls, you established a hotline?
Effectively, the published phone number for Hazelwood became a hotline, and the number of calls and so forth, we outsourced that to a call centre, gave them the information that my understanding is 90% of the calls were dealt with on first contact, which was how do I contact the EPA or how do I contact that and so forth. So we provided, I won't say an information service, but a redirection service. Mm-hmm. And those calls that couldn't be dealt with in that manner or with the information we provided, they were logged and sent to me via email for response, and I had other people dealing with those.
Can you appreciate now, with the benefit of hindsight and having heard the communications experts yesterday, that establishing that hotline may have been interpreted as another pulling up of the drawbridge?
Potentially, yes. I understand that some would see that. It was our response to a need to address the volume of calls we were getting. I get that some people would see it as bringing up the drawbridge. It wasn't the intent, but then again, I would say to you that many things have occurred where some people have interpreted our response a certain way, and that certainly wasn't intended.
I mean, you're part of a huge multinational empire. I mean, I find it sort of inconceivable that, as an international group, you haven't thought through these sorts of things. I mean, you've had events in other parts of the world that have been very difficult to manage. So I'm so interested who was sort of making the call on this to keep your head down. I mean, wouldn't this have gone further up the system? I mean, who was sort of making the call on your approach? Or was it all down to local delegation?
As I said earlier, I think the local assets tend to make a lot of calls about these things. We take advice and we have support from our head office in Australia. I think that rather than say that people weren't making decisions along the way, this was on the run to some extent. When the normal processes that we have been practiced in and understood seem to be just not sufficient, we were looking at that point in time to what can we do for this particular instance. I take your point. It is a very large multinational organisation. GDF Suez has owned it for around 2 or 3 years from memory. There's lots of learnings that we need to take on board from other countries and so forth that have done it better, and we certainly intend to do that.
I mean, just to make the point, and I really appreciate your honesty about this, Mr. Harkins. But the signs were there at the beginning that this could go badly wrong, frankly. And if you're monitoring the social media, you knew the community was in uproar, and it seemed to me that it would be quite reasonable to sort of cry for help from higher authorities, and a crisis team could come flown in from anywhere in the world to help you on this, than you battling on in your own sweet way, if I could use that term.
I understand what you're saying, and as I said, I think that you're right. It was fairly obvious fairly early on that this was going to be not a short-term event. I'm certainly confident that we didn't translate that knowledge out from the operational responses that we were focused on to our broader community engagement, and that certainly is something that we must address in the coming weeks and months. So I don't think that, and I mentioned earlier, and I know that it sounds wrong, but our focus was on getting this bloody fire out, and really we played a bit of catch up, and that's not good enough.
If I can just ask you a few more questions about the call centre that you engaged to answer calls to just your regular switchboard number, was it?
Correct, yes.
That was
That seems
diverted
to be
through
the one
to the
that
call
people were
centre.
calling.
Where was the call centre?
I think it was Adelaide based.
Okay.
We've used this particular, I'm advised we've used this particular service before, not in an emergency context.
And but, the script, call centres tend to operate on the basis of a script, is what you have provided at Annexure 6 to your statement.
Which I believe would have mimicked one of our advertisements from memory.
So the call centre staff weren't given any more information to respond to questions than had already been.
Their instructions were to provide the advice. Anything over and above what we put in the print media, they would take the message and forward them through.
And then Mr. Day would deal with those on an individual basis.
Mr. Day did some of it. I did some of it. So it was a bit of a team effort.
Okay.
to address some of those calls.
And then at Annexure 7, you've provided a log of calls to the hotline, which starts on the 22nd of February. Do we conclude from that that that's when the call centre was brought on board?
From recollection, that's probably correct.
And is there any record of calls received prior to the 22nd of February?
No, they were being taken ad hoc.
You then annex to your statement a number of internal employee briefings, which I have to say are really detailed and interesting, and would have, had they been available, provided filled something of the information gap. What was the reasoning behind stamping each of these not for external distribution?
Generally, we use news briefs to brief our people on a variety of local and business matters that are relevant only to these people. If we were making them available to the external media, they would be a media release. So it's simply to say this is not for external, this is for local consumption only.
Yes. Was there any discussion between you or anyone else on behalf of GDF Sewers and the incident controller as to whether this kind of information could be shared more widely with the public?
There was no direct discussion. It certainly was shared with a number of stakeholders, and I think I make reference to that in my witness statement. And I believe that the incident control media group were recipients of them.
Mm-hmm. But they asked. But
there was no discussion about broader release of the information. No.
And you tell us in your statement about a range of people who you shared these with.
Yes.
But they are stamped not for external distribution, and I take it there was no explicit permission given that this information could be shared more widely.
Correct.
Now, in relation to the clean-up, you tell us at paragraph 72 of your statement that you had a discussion with Mr Mitchell of the council, in which you told him that Hazelwood wanted to make a contribution towards the community asset clean-up. Now, I asked him about that this morning, and he said that was well after the clean-up assistance package had been announced on the 18th of March.
Yes.
Is that when you recall the conversation taking place?
I recall that it was after the assistance package was announced.
Mm-hmm.
What I went with to Mr Mitchell, and I think we'll talk about the other elements shortly, but there was one element that we were aware that and were advised that the council and state government agencies and so forth were doing the clean-up and that had been funded. So I offered $100,000 at that discussion for what I call community asset clean-up.
So playgrounds?
Playgrounds, general community infrastructure and so forth. Mr Mitchell advised me that they were already being cleaned.
Yes.
And so forth. So in the absence of that being directed to cleaning activities, we agreed that I would hold that and use that for another purpose, which was loosely titled community events to bring people into Morwell.
All right. So has that money since been allocated?
No, we haven't spent all of that. There's a potential to allocate, but that's still in discussion.
Right. So the other matters that you outline under donations and financial incentives, they're over and above that $100,000 that remains available?
Yes. We started looking at, and I think we called it revival, and given that the government agencies, the Latrobe Council were looking at the clean-up activities and so forth, we looked to, carefully considered where is the components that we could contribute to, and decided that, given that it's 45 days of pretty dreadful experience, Morwell had taken a reputational damage and so forth, and certainly the retail sector was decimated would be the best word I would use. That we needed to look at things that would revive Morwell, not as this will revive Morwell and everything will be okay, but certainly to kickstart the revival of Morwell and the sense of community and so forth. So we had a number of things. I think I list in there, we made a donation to GERF, Gippsland Emergency Relief Fund. That was just in recognition that they certainly did put out quite a bit of money through the bushfires and unrelated matters in the area, long-standing relationship with them. And then we had our two-prong attack, which was around the Community Social Capital Committee, which I'll talk about if you want me to, and our Revive Mall retail sector.
Right, so the Community Social Capital Committee, we heard about a facet of this from Tracy Lund, who coordinates the Morwell Neighbourhood House. So there's a considerable sum that's been made available, $500,000, to only those community groups?
Yes, what we looked at was in discussions with Mr Mitchell, and I to this day still don't understand the Community Recovery Committee structures and subcommittees and so forth. We're now towards the back end of March, and GDF very much wanted to do something to revive or start the revival process. We had some discussions. I didn't understand those structures. It seemed to me that there would be some delay in those structures becoming operative. We wanted to do something fairly quickly, and so we decided that we had connections with these community groups, and if we have a look across those groups, they were a fairly broad brush. I won't say that they cover all of the community and all the particular groups in the community, but they were certainly a common, bless you. Okay, certainly representative of a wide range of community, of people in the community. So we approached them, would you be willing? And they first met on the 14th of April.
All right, and Ms Lund gave evidence that she'd put forward some fairly modest proposals.
Yes.
I think her lawnmower bank and a new fridge were what she was looking for.
And I'm pleased to say she has.
Yes, she told us that too. Has the $500,000 been allocated fully yet, or is that
not fully? The thinking behind this was that these groups have members that would be able to work at a grassroots level and say, well, what does the community need right now? And how can we best utilise these funds for longer term benefit rather than let's go and spend some money and it's all over and done with. My understanding as of yesterday, there's 41 funding proposals from a variety of sources that these groups have been able to funnel to this committee, with about 228,000 as being the progressive total. Now, I do have a bit of a rundown, but it's not just Neighbourhood House. We have Morwell Men's Shed, Gippsland FM, Community Radio, Enjoy Church, the primary schools. The primary schools, I understand, the next meeting will authorise, I believe, $18,000 to each of the schools for purposes that I'm yet to read. So it was a way to get initiatives and programs running very quickly with a very low level of bureaucracy. They were given a mandate, here's $500,000, they developed their own terms of reference. My only stipulation was I want it spent by November.
All right, and they're helping you in that task.
They are, and 41 submissions since the 14th of April, and some of them are just amazing, and we'll be very hopeful that it'll be well and truly spent and in the community before November.
And then the other initiative that you cover in paragraph 78 is the Revive Morwell initiative,
yes.
Which perhaps didn't start as quickly.
We actually hope to have this running for the Mother's Day weekend, and through contact to the Community Recovery Committee and so forth. I need to back a bit. GDF, and particularly GDF locally, doesn't seek its brand on everything it does. And our original concept was, here's $600,000 to get into the tills of the local retailers. Is there a body of people that can coordinate that? Just a little thing sponsored by GDF Sewers at the bottom. We actually didn't want to make it at that point. Hello, GDF is here. Aren't we terrific? Here's this revival scheme. Unfortunately, that was going to take a lot longer than I'd hoped. We then made a decision that we'll go it alone. We got some terrific support by Russell North, who put us onto the small business. I can't remember the particular person who was a terrific help that helped us work through some of the logistical issues and how to execute it. We hope to have all that done and ready for Mother's Day weekend, so the week leading up to Mother's Day. It's amazingly difficult to get those things organised quickly. And unfortunately, it took about another 3 weeks before we could get things moving.
So it may have been a complete coincidence, but the program was implemented in the first week of public hearings.
It certainly was a coincidence. It's the earliest we could get it going. And look, I can understand. I'll back back. I'm a big believer that there will always be cynics and critics, but that's not a reason not to do good. And we could have halted that particular program because it was very obvious about 2 weeks before that this is going to happen on the first day of this inquiry. But so what? The reality is that the program was designed to do nothing more than to address a dreadful trading period that the local traders had, get some money in their tills, but more importantly, encourage people back to the town of Morwell, the Morwell citizens who were shopping elsewhere during that awful period, to say, hey, it's okay to be shopping back in Morwell. And I received this morning while I was waiting to appear an article from the Express today, and I'm delighted with the response of the traders. The traders are delighted. They had a boom week last week, and one of the traders is quoted as saying it has lifted the mood of the people. That's all that we really wanted to do, and I understand that some people will be cynical and some people... yesterday's criticism of the program I thought was monolithically negative. It was never to be anything other than come back to Morwell, let's get this trading going. I've lived in Morwell all my life, except for the last 6 years, which is about 10 k's out of Morwell now. But you need a vibrant retail traders area to have a sense of community, and that's all it was designed to do. We're delighted that I think $500,000 was spent in 1 week. That's terrific. Yes, we've had some issues along the way. There was a few cards knocked off by some people, but we dealt with that and we've replaced those cards and so forth. Overall, my reading is it was a good initiative.
You mentioned earlier that you'd engaged a public relations firm to assist you with this phase. Were they involved in the preparation and planning of the Revive Morwell?
Not directly.
initiative?
I mean, that was more of a collaborative effort of the communications group, the senior management and so forth. Knowing that the council and government were looking at clean-up, knowing some of the other impacts, not all of the impacts, but some of the other impacts, such as the retail sector, such as people not being able to spend and so forth. This was a localised decision, well supported by Regional HQ. They thought it was a great idea and said, make it happen.
Now, since you're in a reflective mood this afternoon, Mr. Harkins, and since this will be your last appearance before the inquiry, I want to ask you this question. Next week, the inquiry is moving to the area of risk management and prevention, and the inquiry has asked GDF Sewers, senior members of GDF Sewers management, to provide it with statements addressing those issues of risk management, the broad issues of risk management of a highly combustible open-cut coal mine in a bushfire-prone landscape close to a town, how those issues of risk are managed, by the mine, and we've asked those questions of other regulators. And to date, the only statement that has been provided is a highly technical and very helpful statement from James Faithfull, who is not a member of the senior management team. Have you and the other members of your senior management team, including Mr Graham and Mr Wilkinson, the mine director, discussed whether a more senior member of the management team should speak to the inquiry and give evidence to the inquiry about how the mine and GDF Sewers manages this risk in a broad sense?
I think I understand the question. No, and I can certainly say that I haven't been party to any of those discussions because we've been a little preoccupied on other matters. But I'm not surprised that that would be James Faithfull. James is our mine planning manager, and I agree that he's not part of what we call the Matrix leadership team, but he's one step below it and is responsible and accountable for the mine planning, which includes, I assume next week will be on rehabilitation and other risks.
That's one of the issues to be addressed, and I accept, having read his statement, that he is technically able to answer a number of the questions. But there are much broader issues of risk management, including implementation of recommendations of prior reviews, including 2 reviews in 2005 and 2008 of fires that ignited in the worked-out matters of the mine, and the mine's, or Hazelwood's, participation in integrated fire management planning, and the broader issue of risk management of an essential industry with a coal mine that will burn in a bushfire-prone landscape. The inquiry has not been provided with any of that evidence from a member of senior management as it has been requested. Is there any reason why Mr Wilkinson or Mr Graham could not give that evidence to the inquiry?
Look, to be brutally honest, I haven't been party to any discussions on that matter, so I really find it very difficult to answer. Sorry.
Could I just follow that up? You're not part of the discussion, but it's clearly a matter that we are very interested in following through. One way of doing that would be to have you make detailed inquiries, change the position if it's appropriate, or alternatively come back and tell us what the reasons are after you've made the appropriate inquiries. How do you see it?
I'm not quite sure how to answer the question. From my perspective, people like James Faithfull, somebody else has already appeared here, Romeo Prezioso, these people execute the planning, they develop the planning. I would have thought that they were more than competent to be able to address any of the questions that you would have with regard to risk management and planning.
The concern I would have is that they say that isn't a matter that's within our realm, because it's maybe the future long-term thinking or the unawareness or the lack of awareness of past recommendations that have not been implemented. Those are matters that we would be focusing on, and we would not want to be met with an indication of that kind and then have insufficient time to deal with it.
I find myself in a difficult situation because I'm not sure how to answer the question, to be absolutely honest. I would believe that the people that our council are putting up would be more than capable of answering your questions.
Well, perhaps I'll just ask Mr Reardon if you have a particular plan in mind.
Well, the answer to that question, sir, is that I have spoken to Councillor Sisting, or rather, Councillor Sisting and I have spoken this morning, and Councillor Sisting's been good enough to give us a list of the issues which plainly enough are concerning the inquiry on this question. And the difficulty is that different ones of the issues require different people, and we are putting our attention to that question. You raise a good example of it, and that is the recommendation, past recommendation from fires, plainly it's a matter that falls squarely within the terms of reference. The dilemma we have is that we are able to point to documents where there have been audits of each of those recommendations, and there is, in that material, responses, we think, to all of the recommendations, such that we really have a complete response from the documents. So two other things about that. Council Assisting has indicated that there's a couple of recommendations, particularly out of the 2008 fire, that they want us to particularly address, and we have addressed those. I might say that the inquiries about those haven't been entirely exhausted yet. They are going on as we speak, and I think it's fair to say that if the documents we put forward aren't good enough, that it may well be necessary for us to put forward a witness about that. The problem that we're having is that we don't think that the witness is, for example, Mr Wilkinson. I'm comfortable enough about putting Mr Wilkinson in the box, but he'd then be just regurgitating many things of his inquiries. At that particular point, recommendation 6 of the 2008 inquiry, which talks about a risk assessment, probably aware of it, is one that we have identified. We're trying to track down precisely what happened with respect to it. And in fact, we're still not sure. There wasn't a formal risk assessment done. So we're hoping to get evidence for it. But our concern is that the person who can really give you evidence about that, for example, is not Mr Wilkinson. It'll be the person who attended to it, which was probably Romeo Rosario. So, Prezioso, got it wrong again. But that's one issue, but that's a more technical issue. But then when the questions you've now directed are, if one like, a broader question as to the future, which hasn't quite been identified to us as something that's going to be discussed in the broad, that is something we need to turn our attention to about how we can meet that question.
The difficulty at the moment is just one of timing. I don't know whether, I haven't looked at what you planned for next week, but it may well be we accelerate Mr Faithful, because that may accelerate the need to, in effect, focus on issues when we've been spending our time on other things. One skim reads other material without having a deep appreciation of the gaps and further matters needing attention.
Yes. Can I give you some more examples, just to try to identify our problem, and you may well be able to feed into it. But we've received questions, for example, about the checklist and the aerial photography. And these are technical matters, and we've sought the right person, and we think we've got the best response that we can put forward to it. There's questions about the risk assessment for the removal of pipes that Mr Dugan was asked about. That's taken our attention too, and we think we've got as much information as we've got about that.
Well, that's an area that we're obviously going to be very interested in.
Yeah, and we've been working on these things, but I suppose I'm trying to identify each of these questions actually involve different inquiries, and we're trying to put forward the best person, even given the fact that this inquiry will take hearsay, but the best person who could really withstand some questioning about it, has the most knowledge of it. And they're three different persons for those three different questions, each of which we've discerned this inquiry has a particular interest in. But it's certainly been said to us, well, sort of, where's Mr Wilkinson? And we're saying, well, by all means, if Mr Wilkinson can add something, we're comfortable about having him called. But if it's form over substance, we'll put him up there and swear him in and allow somebody to ask him questions. But the issues that have been identified have all tended to be issues, and the recommendation's a good example of it, which require particular people to be able to really give answers to it. So that's the tension. And I have a further response, and I'll be communicating with Council Assisting. But all I can say is that Your Honour's intervention is very helpful from our point of view in identifying what the inquiry is, and I think that as much communication to us would be appreciated, because we've been concentrating, I emphasise, we've been concentrating on trying to get answers to particular questions such as pipelines, implementation of recommendations and the like. But if what one's looking for is a grand plan, that hasn't really been the focus of our attention. If I could say that, then I'll certainly pick up discussions, if I can, even on adjournment today with...
Yes, well, I think that's highly desirable.
I had one or two questions to Mr. Harkins, and your time is almost over, so hang in there, please. Does GDF Suez have a corporate social responsibility strategy?
It does, and part of that is, I spoke earlier about our educational frameworks, the picture. That's part of it, but only part of the overall strategy.
And so that's local and national? Or how does
local
it work?
and national, yes.
It would be very helpful to have a copy of that strategy, if that's possible. And do you have a target percentage expenditure that you aim to achieve in terms of giving back to the community?
Not per se. We tend to have a look at programs and initiatives. For example, like all private enterprises, we're budgeting for next year now. So there's a couple of new initiatives that we'd like next year. So
but you'd have a budget then that you're
Yes.
working to.
Yes.
Can you provide us with that?
I should be able to do that, yes.
Now, some other questions which I'm sure will be on the record, but what is your annual turnover at Hazelwood? And I'm not talking about tons of coal, I'm talking about dollars.
I need to take the question on note. It's been a while since I've had a look at that. Certainly our revenues would well exceed the 400 million. Our costs, unfortunately, also exceed 400 million. So I need to take it on note, and I'm sure that we've...
Well, it would be very helpful to provide that, because we wouldn't want to get the figure wrong in our report.
I may have just collapsed the share price.
And also, within that, could you give us an indication of how much tax or licence fees you pay to the Victorian government?
I will defer and say yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
No questions, thank you.
May Mr. Harkins be excused? Yes. I'm sure he'll be relieved.
Thank you.
That concludes the evidence for this week. Next week we move to the issue of mitigation and prevention, which we will be attempting to examine in the Broad. There are some highly technical aspects of it, both in terms of mine operation and in terms of regulation, but the focus of next week will be examining the broad issue of the management of the very obvious risk of an open-cut coal mine in a bushfire-prone landscape next to a town catching fire. And we hope that by the end of the week we will have some answers as to how that risk may be managed better in future. Monday is, of course, a public holiday. Tuesday will resume, and the witnesses on Tuesday will be Kylie White, who is the Executive Director, Earth Resources Development at the Department of State Development and Business Innovation. I think I have that right, DSDBI, which I will refer to as the mine regulator because it's easier to say. And we have a community witness, Rob Galton, who is a retired managing mine geologist, formerly employed by the State Electricity Commission. And also we will have evidence from the Latrobe City Council, Jason Pullman, who is the Coordinator of Strategic Planning, who will be addressing land use planning issues.
All stand.